And now I'm ready to welcome our speaker, or welcome back our speaker, Kaeli Swift. Kaylee, you may remember, was our last in-person speaker back in March before we all got shuttered away in our homes for the past 4 months. So I'm really happy that Kaylee's willing to come back and talk with us. I'm especially happy about the topic she's doing tonight about Canada Jays. She was going to do a keynote for the Sandhill Crane Festival back in March, and that got canceled. So I'm really glad we have the opportunity to hear her give this presentation tonight. Let's see. You probably know Kaylee, you may have known Kaylee from her research with crows. She was made famous the concept of a crow funeral, and she did her master's and graduate work at UW studying crows, but then she was able to go on and do a postdoc still with UW in Denali, studying the caching behavior of Canada Jays. And this, well, I'm excited to hear this talk tonight. There was another screen that was up earlier that had her link on her for her Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. So you can follow Kaylee in other ways. She's got a lot of publications out there, and she's a person that I'm really impressed with her work, her research, and just the person that she is. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Kaeli Swift. Thank you, Kaylee.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. And if I may, just very briefly, I want to dovetail off something you talked about earlier, Cinny. Elaine was kind enough, I don't know how many people sort of paid attention to the rotating slide during the introduction, but Elaine was kind enough to put together a slide on my behalf. And one of the things she included on that slide was the screenshot of a Facebook group, West Coast Birders. I'm not sure how many people saw, but yesterday there was an article that came out in KUOW that discussed some of the ways that our birding communities in the Pacific Northwest, particularly on Facebook, have made a really disappointing response to the call on behalf of our birders of color to allow space for them to talk about their experiences. And so that's been, as a birder, as a person in the West Coast, it was tremendously disappointing to see that. I talked to many of the admins of these groups personally, asking that they allow space for those conversations. And the answer was just a resounding no. We want birds to be just joyful and escapism, and that's all we want our community to be. And as Cindy mentioned earlier, the reality is that's an incredibly privileged position. It's incredibly privileged to look at birding exclusively as a way to escape from the world and escape from some of the negativity in the world. And I think it's crucial if we want to be true to our mission to make birding accessible to everybody, and it absolutely should be. Birding, as we all know, is one of the most beautiful and grounding hobbies a person can dedicate themselves to. And the thought that some people are too afraid to go into their communities to engage in this wonderful activity is something that should move us all to listen to them, even when we might want to just take a beat and ignore it because we can. It is crucial that we listen to those voices. So in response to some of the censorship that was happening on Facebook, myself and a number of colleagues created the West Coast Birders group. So to whom that interests, please seek us out. It is a space for you to share your bird sightings and ask questions and share stories, but is also a place to have conversations about how we can make birding a safe and accessible space for everybody in the West Coast. So that's all I will say about that. But I really appreciate, Cindy, you bringing that up in this context. I just think it's so important that we are, that we have space to share that and talk about that and not feel like it's an issue that is in any way taboo. It should be at the front of our minds. So with that, let's talk about Canada Jays. I'm just gonna get rid of this screen so it's not in the way. Nope, I don't want to leave the meeting. Nope. Just push you aside. All right, so hopefully everybody can see my screen. But what I'm going to be talking about today, if you attended my lecture on crows, I will forewarn you that the format's a little different today. It's less kind of storytelling and more of a science presentation on what it was that I found during this little over a year that I was able to spend in Denali National Park in Alaska studying the foraging ecology of Canada jays. So let's start with something that is hopefully very familiar to all. I don't know if any folks are joining us who have lived in Alaska or who may be there now, but as it may not surprise you, it is quite tough to live in Alaska. It can be, you know, upwards of -50 degrees Fahrenheit in some parts of the park in the middle of winter. And as a result, there's not a ton of wildlife that can call this place home year-round. During the breeding season, there are around 160 bird species that can be found in Denali. It is a wonderful place for birding, but of those, only 21 of them choose not to make the flight south to more warm and inviting conditions, and instead live in the park year-round. So right away, I just want to take a minute to highlight some of these birds, because I think we really, it's a good opportunity to just be in awe that animals that are in many ways so fragile are able to tough it out in this very extreme Arctic environment. So these are some photos of Denali's resident birds, lots of goshawks. Those are probably one of the most common raptors. I also had the pleasure of seeing gyrfalcons during the breeding season, not during the winter, however. But goshawks are really common birds you'll see all year round. And they really are one of the main animals in the park that make you appreciate how important the snowshoe hares are to establishing really an entire food web. And when I took this particular picture of this goshawk, we had been chasing jays around, actually near one of the campsites. And we stumbled, it was on the ground, and we kind of ran up on it because we're always running through the woods. It flew off into a tree and just kind of perched there. And it's a little bit hard to see, but you can see its talons are bloody. And when we sort of took stock of the scene, we realized it had just been on a snowshoe hare carcass, which was pretty cool to see. And it's food like that that comprises a lot of the protein opportunities for a variety of Denali's other residents, as you'll see, like Canada jays, but also things like pine squirrels, other animals too. Of course, in the middle there, we have a great horned owl. Man, I gotta tell you, last year, there must have been at least 3 different great horned owl nests in the span of about a mile. It was really neat. There's something about listening to owls, particularly great horned owls at night, that is just one of the most just kind of gets you right in the heart. The sound that they make is so moving. And there's just something incredibly, I'm not quite sure the word to put it, it just connects you with nature in this really profound way. So it was so fun to be able to watch these nests and especially check in on the fledglings towards the end of summer when they were just so awkwardly trying to figure out the world. And one of my favorite memories, there's a little glacial lake called Horseshoe Lake in the front country of the park. And I was sitting on a bench watching the lake one evening, and there were a couple of ducks on the water. And this one little fledgling great horned owl just tried so hard. It must have tried 5 times to swoop down and grab one of those ducks, and it just could never get the sneak on them. But how fun to be able to watch these birds. And then 3-toed woodpeckers were all over the place. They were just incredibly bold. They would just be right on a tree right next to you. It was so fun. The northern hawk owls, this was another one. It was interesting. My first field season, so as you'll see, I was in Denali basically from the spring of 2018 over the course of several independent field seasons to the fall of 2019. And that first fall and summer, we saw a lot of northern hawk owls. And then for some reason, our last handful of the field seasons, we didn't see any. And they're an interesting species because they tend to follow those kind of eruptive cycles where they can be really common one year and then not so common the next. But this particular moment that I photographed was my very first foray into the park. It was my first time visiting, and when we were doing this field work, we were lucky enough that all of the field work occurred in what's called the front country. So I'm not sure if any of you have been to Denali Park or if you've been to any national parks, but when you, generally speaking, when you first get into a national park, there's a lot more infrastructure. There's a visitor center, sometimes there's even lodging, that kind of thing. And that area is what we refer to as the front country. Versus when you're in the interior of the park where there really isn't any infrastructure, that's what we are referring to when we say the back country. And so because Denali is pretty remote, there is a lot of on-site employee housing, and I was lucky enough to be able to stay there when I was doing my research. And so on this particular day, I was just entering some data on my computer, and we're in these little like cabins. They were really nice, actually. You know, they have a little kitchen, they don't have a bathroom, but yeah, pretty good accommodations for field work. And I'm working on my computer, and I can hear the magpies just going to like, they were so aggravated. And I don't know if you'll remember this from my crow talk for those of you who attended, or perhaps I didn't even say it, but I'm a huge proponent that paying attention to corvids is one of the birder, because corvids are really good at alerting you to something cool in the neighborhood. Because whether it's magpies or crows, if you hear them really aggressively alarm calling, it's usually because there's something cool. So on this particular occasion, I heard the magpies really just going crazy, and I grabbed my camera and I ran outside and I looked around and I saw this northern hawk owl. And it was on top of this little snow mound, just kind of across from my cabin, right next to the front door of another. And it had just killed this pine squirrel. And so I just kind of hunkered down with my camera and watched it really, I think for probably about a half an hour. And at one point, the sort of pose it's giving there is it kind of ruffled its feathers, and then it just went to town tearing the squirrel apart. But for the sensitive of heart, I did not include those pictures. But it was just an incredible moment to watch a predator so close to the active predation. That's the kind of thing that gets me going as an ecologist. This other picture is of a spruce grouse. Spruce grouse are all over the place. They are just really neat birds. I love those red combs, and the males just kind of strut around and do their thing, and yeah, pretty neat. Here are some of the smaller resident birds. Dippers, surprisingly, dippers are around in the park year-round. And this is like a huge ecological mystery, because if you're familiar with dippers, which I would think that majority of you would be, you'll know these birds are incredibly unique among songbirds because they actually go underwater to forage. But considering it's, you know, anywhere from 0 to -50 degrees in the park, and all of the water sources are completely frozen over, where are the dippers foraging at this time of year? We don't know the answer to that. And to date, no one has done a comprehensive ecological study of dippers in Denali. So that's an open question. White-winged crossbills are common. The boreal chickadees are just adorable. And then we have both rock and willow ptarmigan in Denali. This is a rock ptarmigan. They change their plumage in the winter to be more camouflaged, so they take on a completely white appearance. And as birds do, when they are trying to conserve heat, they will puff out all of their feathers as a means of trapping air. It basically creates like an accentuated version of a down coat. And that's what this rock ptarmigan is doing. And it is basically just a snowball with eyes, and it's so cute. I love this picture. And if you haven't ever heard the vocalizations that rock ptarmigans make when they're breeding, at the end of the talk, I can't recommend this enough. Google it, YouTube it. It is one of the most delightful sounds in the bird world. Among different families, there's probably no one family that's better represented in the park than corvids. We have both black-billed magpies and ravens. There are no crows in interior Alaska in Denali, so we don't have them, unfortunately. But I got a lot of time around ravens and magpies, which are right up there with my favorite corvids, so I'm not going to complain. And now that brings us to what was the focus of my study, the Canada jay. And for those of you who are maybe less familiar with these birds, we have them here in Washington. You can see them, for example, really, if you go up high in elevation, Mount Si, Washington Pass, those kinds of areas, you're very likely to encounter them. And Canada jays are, they're like a chickadee in terms of their proportions. They're very, very cute. But they're much bigger actually than most people realize, because when they look at a picture, they just have those little kind of infantile proportions that give people the impression that they're small. But they're about the same size as a Steller's jay. They're quite big birds actually. So before we go on with the actual research, I wanted to answer a question that some of you might have come here with, which is, what is up with the name? They're called Canada jays now, but you could have sworn that until recently it was gray jay, and then sometimes you hear people call them camp robbers, and sometimes you hear people call them Whisky Jacks, and like, what is the deal? Why do they have so many names, and why was the name recently changed to Canada jay? So I hope you guys find, I personally think this is a really interesting story, so I'm gonna go into like a little bit of detail about it. Hopefully this isn't too much review for you. But I think it's important to fully appreciate the history of this bird. So the timeline or the kind of like big moments for the name change of this bird include a contest, some sad Canadians, the results of the contest, and then sadder Canadians. So let's dive into kind of what happened. All right. So back in, gosh, what was it, 2016 or so, now the dates are gonna get a little fuzzy, I should have looked them up before the talk, but the kind of birding community in Canada was like, hey, we have a lot of national stuff, right? Like we have a national tree and we have a national, animal, but we don't have a national bird, and we want to have a national bird. So the Royal Canadian Geographical Society held this contest where people could vote for what would be named Canada's national bird. And do I have this on the next slide? Nope. They narrowed it down to 4 different contestants, of which the Canada jay was one. But unfortunately, the Canada jay was not doing very well in this contest. People weren't really voting for it at the rates that other people in the birding community thought that they should, and particularly among that community of Canadians that were very sad that the Canada jay wasn't as yet more popular, included a collaboration of researchers who have a multi-decade project on Canada jays in Algonquin National Park. Right, so for this group of scientists who've been studying these birds for, in some cases, the majority of their careers, they were very hurt by the fact that Canadians didn't seem to be recognizing why they should love these birds as much as they thought they should. And part of the reason, part of what they thought was maybe the problem, is that Canada jays didn't have, no longer had the historic kind of nationality and patriotism that they once did. And what I mean by that is, so this is John James Audubon's plate for Canada jays. And you can see that he refers to them here as Canada jays and not gray jays. And so this kind of peaks or like hints at this history, this storied history that these birds have, that actually historically they used to be called Canada jays and not gray jays. And so what these researchers decided to do is they wanted to bring the historic name back, because they thought that would maybe help the public, the Canadian public, feel more national pride in the Canada jay and hopefully choose it as the winner for this contest. And so the kind of backstory there is these researchers led by Dan Strickland did an incredibly comprehensive, like they went to the National Archives to really get a comprehensive history of the name change. And essentially what happened was, and this is all in the early 20th century, we just had a very mismatch and not very systematic way of naming species. That's kind of what this story boils down to. And so birders were getting together, you know, the sort of AOS version of the day, were getting together and saying, all right, we have all of these different species names and subspecies names, but there's no consistency in the nomenclature. So you can't tell from a species name, for example, if it's a subspecies or not, or if it's a member of sort of a related taxa of animals. And so they wanted to create a more consistent naming scheme that would help elucidate some of this confusion. And so there was a lot of back and forth, and what they decided is, okay, if we have a species of which there are either subspecies or related animals, we're going to make sure that whatever name we give it is one that's not going to produce any kind of geographic confusion. So what I mean by that is if there are subspecies of Canada jays that we're going to name them specific to the region that they're from, right? Because that will create this really easy to follow like nomenclature tree, where, for example, if there's a subpopulation of this bird that lives in California and another one in Alaska and another one in Colorado, it would be very confusing to have the Alaskan Canada jay or the California Canada jay. So we are going to use instead one of the subspecies names at the time, which was the gray jay. We are going to now apply that as the base species name. That way, when we implement this naming scheme where all subspecies get a geographic designation, there isn't that kind of confusion. So it took a lot of back and forth, but they finally passed that resolution where they were going to do that, but then they didn't. They didn't adopt this new naming scheme where all subspecies got this geographic like link in their name. And so because of that, according to AOS's own bylaws, the name should have reverted back to the historic name, meaning it should have reverted back from gray jay to Canada jay. And that is more or less the argument that Dan Strickland made to AOS in 2018 as a means of saying, you know, you owe it to us to, according to your own laws, to change this name back to Canada jay. And so that is why the name change happened. So so then where the story goes is that happened. And unfortunately, the name change didn't happen before the end of the results, you know, because things move a little slow with AOS. But the name change didn't happen before the contest ended. And maybe as a result, maybe not, the Canada jay was failed to be named the national bird according to the popular vote. But in a story that may feel just flinchingly familiar to Americans, for whatever reason, the Canadian Geographical Society decided that not only would there be a popular vote, but there would be what sort of essentially amounted to an electoral vote where a panel of scientists representing a bunch of different fields would have the ultimate say. And so what happened was, despite the fact that the popular vote actually voted for the common loon as the national bird, the panel was convinced, perhaps in part to the very heartfelt, compelling from folks like Dan Strickland, to name the gray jay, as it was known at the time, as Canada's national bird. Hence, headlines like this, where Canada names its new national bird as the gray jay. But here's the thing. I told you that this story ends with the most sad Canadians. So far we appreciate the contest. We understand why folks like Dan Strickland were made very sad because people were not voting for the gray jay, Canada jay, as they thought. The contest results came out. By the way, I should tell you, this was like a really big deal in Canada. The fact that they didn't go with the popular vote for this bird really ticked a lot of people off. So, you know, as I kind of brushed over that, but this was actually a very big deal in Canada at the time. But the kind of bow on top of all of this, the sort of funniest part is that while all of this was going on, and this took basically a year, this whole process, the actual Canadian government never had any intention of really naming a national bird. So by the time all of this was said and done, none of it mattered because the nation of Canada was like, okay, well, we don't have a national bird still, so I don't know why you did this contest. So hence the really sad Canadians at the end of the day who still in 2020 lack a national bird. And even if they didn't, who knows what percent of the country would feel like the Canada Jay was the true winner of that contest. So if you want an even more detailed version of the name change story that better reflects the dates and the particular players and some of the resources that Dan Strickland tapped to make his argument to AOS, I have an article on my blog, but that's kind of like the general gist of what is up with this bird. Oh, and I should add before I move on that the term camp robber is a colloquial name. And then the last one that I told you about, Whisky Jack, is actually an Anglicization of the Algonquin language family name, the indigenous Cree name for these birds. And that's actually a really interesting bit of history, particularly in this moment where many people are trying to think of ways to sort of decolonize our bird names, because many people in Canada actually prefer to use Whisky Jack as the name. And so that's one of the rare examples of when you know, it's not quite an indigenous name because obviously there's that Anglicization, but where a more or less indigenous name is one of the most common ways that people actually refer to a species. So, you know, if you want my 2 cents, I think we should just go with the indigenous name because that is way better than any of these other ones, in my opinion. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's return to thinking about the Arctic. And so far, I have just shocked you, I'm sure, with the fact that it is cold and pretty tough to live in the Arctic. So right now, I'm about to show you one more thing that I'm sure is just going to blow everyone's mind. And that's that it is getting warmer in the Arctic, alarmingly warm. In fact, the kinds of warming schemes we're seeing in the Arctic are vastly out of step and out of proportion for how we're seeing, you know, the pace of climate change in more central equatorial parts of the world. So given that this is true, and this is impacting and manifesting in a variety of ways in the Arctic, scientists, particularly agencies like the National Park Service, like Denali National Park specifically, are very, very interested in trying to track how this warming is going to impact wildlife, right? Because our national parks are in part managers of those spaces. And so in order to be able to effectively manage and conserve, we need to have some prediction of what different populations may be doing in the future. So there is a real need to understand how the kinds of warming trends that we're seeing in Denali National Park might impact the wildlife that lives there. So back in 2009, Denali's resource stewardship strategy basically identified this knowledge gap in the ecology of resident birds. There are a lot of research efforts to understand the migratory species that are in the park. You know, there's a lot of work that's done in the summer there, but those 21 species of resident bird have really kind of gotten short stick in terms of how much effort has been put to understand their presence in the park. And if there's one group that might best sort of act as a litmus test for how a community is responding to climate change, it's going to be the resident species. So this resource council identified Canada Jays for a 30-year monitoring project with the aim of essentially choosing, again, just one of these resident species and using them as kind of a litmus test to see how things might be working in the park. Now I'm just going to give you a spoiler alert here that this was the plan. It was supposed to be a 30-year monitoring project. Unfortunately, I have strong doubts that that is going to happen at this point. There was a lot of sort of political, I should say like bureaucratic, not political. Political meaning like the politics of what it means to work in an office building. Reasons why that might not be happening, but fortunately for me, we were able, as you'll see, to complete our part of the project. And I very much hope that the folks in Denali return to this project, because there was an incredible amount of effort to get it off the ground. And it was disappointing for all of us involved to see this project wither out, but that was the plan initially. So you may be wondering, well, how did they pick Canada jays? There are plenty of other birds in the park, you know, look at those little boreal chickadees, like, oh, so cute. Why didn't they pick the boreal chickadees? Well, there is a very important reason and a very unique aspect of Canada jay ecology that made them very prime targets for this study. So one of the first things about them is that they breed incredibly early. These are one of the earliest breeders in the park, and on a particularly harsh winter, it can be upwards of -40 degrees Fahrenheit when these birds are incubating eggs. So they have some unique kind of ecological demands in order to be able to successfully breed in those kinds of conditions. The other aspect, and the thing that's going to be the focus of this talk, that's really different about jays, is that they're what we call a cache obligate scatter hoarder. So let me take a minute to completely break down that term. Caching refers to the hiding or the storage of food for future use, right? So when your dog buries a bone in the backyard, it's caching it. When you give crows peanuts and they tuck some away in the grass, that's an example of caching. Now, the difference between when crows do that, or your Steller's jays, and when Canada jays do that is where that word obligate comes in. So a bird like a crow or a Steller's jay, you know, you give them a handful of peanuts, they eat some on the spot, they tuck some of them into the gutter, and the fact is most of those peanuts that they cache, they're never going to recover because they don't need to. There's so much food around that they'll forget about it and it'll get left there, and you'll have peanuts growing in your garden and in your gutters by the next year. So they're what we would call a facultative or kind of optional cacher. But some animals, including Canada jays, they have to rely on those caches almost exclusively, or so we think, to persist over the kind of winter and early spring. Because, you know, given that it's potentially -40 degrees when these birds are breeding, there's not a lot of food around. It's covered in snow, everything is frozen, and so with the exception of those snowshoe hairkills that I mentioned earlier, there is a really limited opportunity for foraging for fresh food. So being able to rely on these caches are a crucial way that this hardy winter bird survives in this ecosystem. And then the last part of that phrase, scatter hoarder, that refers to how animals cache their food. So if any of you have ever encountered like a squirrel larder when you've been walking around, or acorn woodpeckers are a really good example. Some animals kind of put all their eggs in one basket, so to speak. They have a specific place where all of their cache food goes, and it can be kind of in these underground larders, like for a squirrel, or it can be on one particular granary tree, like for an acorn woodpecker. But, and the advantage there is if you are capable of it, maybe because you have a really robust social system, as acorn woodpeckers do, or you're just tough as nail like pine squirrels, having everything in one place means that it can sometimes be easier to defend, and there's a lot less energy that goes into recovering it because it's just right there. But for some birds like Canada jays or Clark's nutcrackers or pinion jays, their strategy is to try and reduce the risk of theft by hiding their food all over their territory. It's really widely dispersed. It's scattered. So that's what that phrase really breaks down to. And so the reason that this is so important is this provides this kind of context that we can be looking at, this foraging element that we can be looking at, where they have to hide food that they rely on during the winter. Now, I want to take one more little detour to tell you about something that I bet most of you had never thought about. I certainly had not spent much time thinking about bird spit before this research project. And the reality is that most birds don't produce all that much spit. Woodpeckers are an exception to that, and Canada jays. Actually, before I get to the video, I'm going to back up really quick. So I'll say a little bit more about this. So all birds, salivate to some extent, but Canada jays, because it would be hugely disadvantageous to cache on the ground like Clark's nutcrackers do, or like crows often do, that's not a very good strategy for them, because they would be so covered in snow. It can snow many, many feet in Denali and other boreal forests where these birds live. The food would be completely covered. It would be really hard to recover this food if it was, buried under several feet of snow. So instead, what they do is they actually cache their food on primarily vertical surfaces. And the way that they do that is Canada jays have enormous salivary glands, on par with woodpeckers, and really the largest of any songbird. Because remember, corvids are songbirds. And so what they do when they get a bolus of food is they take it into their bills and they kind of roll it around with their tongue, and they absolutely coat it in this saliva. And this saliva is incredibly sticky. And then they can, they'll most often kind of tuck it under a piece of bark, as you can kind of see in this photo, but they can literally, they could glue it to a perfectly flat surface and it would just stick right there. So now I want to just show you a quick video of what this looks like, because it's so unique among birds. So you're going to see two versions. You're going to see the high-speed version and the slowed. So that was it. It just cached. That was real time. So right here, you see it sticking its bill under the bark, and it's deposited that food. You can see the trail of saliva coming off of it. So let's play that one more time, just because it happened so quick. So again, the first move, when you see the real-time clip, you're going to see it kind of like doop, 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 stick its bill under the bark, and then it kind of looks up the branch, and it picks off a little piece, and it sticks it right back there. And that's, you might have seen the crows do that, where they'll like hide food in a hole, and then they'll like take a piece of grass and like cover it up. And it's doing that exact same thing. And then watch, for the second viewing, watch for that trail of saliva, just to get a sense of like how salivatory these birds are. And they're always just smacking their food. They probably have the worst table manners of any bird I've ever seen, but it is just adorable. Speaking of adorable, the best part of this whole story, so I started this, when I introduced these jays, I was like, look, they're really cute. They're like little boreal chickadees, except they're big. The reason that they're so cute is because think about how these birds look relative to any other jay you can think of, like a Steller's jay or a pinion jay. The main difference is that their bills are really short. And that's what gives them that very kind of baby-like proportion to their face. The reason that their bills are so short is, well, I should say, in other jays, the reason that their bills are so long is because they need them to dig into the ground to deposit those caches. But for these birds, because they have that really sticky saliva and there isn't that same level of probing into the environment to hide or deposit caches, they can have these really short little bills. So it is because of the Canada jays' absolutely prolific amounts of saliva that they create that they can be as cute as they are, which is maybe the only example in nature of when salivating enormously actually makes you cuter than if you didn't. So the last component of this puzzle, just a reminder, we're talking about like why they picked Canada jays. What was so interesting about Canada jays that we would dedicate a multi-decade study to understanding them? The last piece of this puzzle is that unlike most other obligate cachers, things like pinyon jays, Canada jays cache primarily perishable food, things that will rot. So animal flesh, berries, insects, right? Most other cachers you can think of are animals that are caching things with very long shelf lives, like pinyon seeds and acorns. Really, the only other animal in nature that has this strategy like Canada jays are wolverines. So one of my colleagues, she loved to say that Canada jays are essentially the wolverines of the sky. So where all of this comes together is in this idea that it is warming in the Arctic. Simultaneously, you have an animal that, in order to persist over the winter, relies on caching foods that are preserved through the coldness of the environment, right? Like meat is going to last a really long time, frozen solid on a tree in the middle of winter. Not so much potentially if it is so warm that that ice is melting. So that's where this concept of the freezer is breaking comes into play. Canada jays essentially use their environment as a food storage option, as a real life, territory-wide freezer. And the consequence of climate change that we're seeing now in the Arctic is that that freezer is breaking. So the question is, how are Canada jays going to respond to this changing environment? And should we expect to see declines in their reproductive success as a result of this shifting climate? So, and then the other kind of components that come into play here is, I mentioned, when I was telling you the story about the name change, that there is a very long ongoing study in Algonquin National Park on their population of Canada jays, and they have already documented reproductive declines. So there is some sort of legitimacy and context for this idea that these birds might be in a little bit of trouble. And then, of course, there was a knowledge gap in Denali National Park that really, demanded a more close look at a resident species. So just to orient people, if they're not sure, Algonquin National Park is way over on the eastern coast of Canada. And then, of course, Denali is about as far as we could get in North America in central interior Alaska. So the goals for our particular part of this project, and by ours, I mean the University of Washington, because as Cinny said, I was a postdoctoral researcher with the UW when I conducted this project, was to first and foremost really describe and quantify foraging and caching behaviors. And this was a really fun study for me to participate in, because at this point in time, kind of natural history research projects like this are very few and far between. They're very hard to get funded because they don't necessarily have the kinds of really explicit, particularly human-oriented applications or outcomes that is the thing that gets funding now. And in fact, as a side note, just to kind of make people appreciate the climate, if pardon the pun, that we are conducting science in now, right before we started this project, these things, it's all National Park Service is who funds this and does this. And so as a result, there's a lot of bureaucratic red tape. Things take a long time. So this project had sort of been in the wheels of getting approved for many years. But in the year before I started this project, we ended up having to completely change all of the language in the official documentation of the project's goals to remove any reference to climate change, because there was a secret, not so secret directive that the federal government wasn't going to support any projects whose specific goals were to evaluate climate change. So instead, we had to say that the context for this project was an understanding, visitor experience, by saying, well, we need to know Canada jays, because when people come to Denali National Park, they love to see the Canada jays. So this impacts visitor experience in the park. But that was our main goal. And it was, again, just a pretty straightforward natural history project, which was really fun. And the idea there was to then facilitate future experiments that might be more traditional controlled studies. So here is a look at my different field sites. This map is probably not helpful to you unless you have a very good mental image of how Denali National Park is laid out. But suffice it to say, this is the highway that you would take to get into the park if you were driving from Fairbanks, for example. And then this gray area is all the park. This is that front country I was talking about. So this area right here is a really big campground. Then you kind of drive through this area. This is where the visitor center is. This is where some of the government buildings are. And then once you pass this area, you are officially into the park and in what we would call the backcountry. So this just kind of illustrates our sites weren't very far apart. All of these little circles represent caches that we GPSed. And then the different colors correspond to our different territories that we monitored. So this just breaks down, for example, in this one particular area, which is right by those residents that I mentioned earlier. This is where a lot of the staff live. These are just a close-up look at that, so you can see all of these. These are all cache trees that the birds hid their food in, and you can see a couple of different territories represented here. So the work was broken down into 4 field seasons. Basically, we were there at the peak caching periods or recovery periods. So the peak caching periods are going to be in the fall, from August to November, and then the peak, what we would assume anyway, the peak recovery periods are going to is winter, starting in March, because again, that's when they're breeding, and so they've just got more sort of caloric demands at that time. We monitored a total of 8 focal territories. So those were territories we were visiting basically every other day, so that we could get a lot of data. Instead of getting a little bit of data on a bunch of birds, we wanted a lot of data on what just a few birds were doing in terms of their foraging ecology. So our main kinds of data quantities that we were capturing were to document foraging behaviors. So we wanted to know, like, where do they look for food? Are they spending most of their time on the ground? Are they most of the time in the trees? We wanted to document caching behaviors. So once they find a piece of food, how far do they fly before they tuck it into a tree? Where on a tree do they put it? Do they orient it in any particular way? We also monitored kennels. So Denali is unique in that it's the only national park with an on-site year-round dog kennel. The reason for that is big swaths of Denali are considered wildland areas where you can't have any kind of vehicle. And so sled dogs are still a really important way that resources are disseminated to some of the remote areas within the national park. And then we also deployed camera traps. If we could see a cache and it was kind of low enough to the ground, we would set out a camera trap so that we could monitor how quickly the birds recover the caches, who's recovering them, do they ever get stolen, that kind of thing. Oh, so this is just, sorry, I forgot to click on the circles, but they're just showing, like, when we talk about where they're caching, for example, do they cache in needles? Do they cache on bare branches? Are they on the exterior of the tree, interior, so on and so forth? And the reason we were interested in that level of detail is because that's the kind of stuff that a future systematic experiment could look at in order to be able to test how well these caches survive under different temperature regimes. Because believe it or not, within the interior of trees, there's actually a very distinct microclimate. And so it would be important for us to know exactly the scenarios that these birds are caching in if we wanted to kind of replicate how climate change might impact the survivability of these food items. So how we actually did all of that was through chasing them through the woods with video cameras and filming them. We were basically just bird paparazzi. And this was one of the most non-traditional and fun, very frustrating at the same time, ways that I will probably ever try and collect data on a bird. And while this feels like a really straightforward way to learn about a species, I'm going to tell you right now, and any photographers in the audience may more deeply appreciate this, but as it turns out, this is a very difficult way to try and capture jay activity.
For roadside.
Oops. So I am going to just give you a little preview into what trying to capture the foraging activity of these birds was really like in the field with this brief blooper reel.
And right back here. And away it goes. Did it leave? No. Oh, there it goes. Roadside, mile 4. Down here, somewhere. Scratch that. Mile 4 roadside. Can you see what it's doing? I can just see its butt. No. And if it had a bug. Oh, no. You ate the bug. It just ate something, huh? I missed it. I don't know where it got it from. Yeah, definitely yellow something. Where'd it go? Pick something up. I can't get it to focus. There's too much stuff in the way. I think if it's still there. Oh, there it goes. It was just on the ground. Now it's off. It's off the ground still. And flying. Where's it now? Is it on the tip? No. Okay, that's good cache. Right? Like it has food. Or is it getting it out? I don't know. Oh, blurry. Okay. Dress strap down. And off it goes.
Had something.
Is it left? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you know, it's definitely my least favorite version of following them. You're constantly on their tail and you can't ever see anything. And so you're just tired. Come on, stay there. I gotcha.
I hope and assume everyone could hear the audio for the video. I'm deeply sorry if you could not, but it was basically me just like being really frustrated most of the time. And this was, I will definitely tell you, this was the most PC version of these clips that I could find because it was often not. It's very frustrating. And so what we would do is we would spend the first half of the day chasing these birds. So we would go visit their territory. We'd use playback to try and locate them. And then we would just follow them. I'd follow them with the camera as long as I could. And then after a few hours, we'd hit the next territory. And then we would wrap up by about midday. And so for the second half of the day, then we would just have to re-watch all of this video footage to actually pull out the specific data. Like, okay, I captured a 3-second clip like I showed you earlier of a bird caching. So then we would record, what it cached if we could tell. Slowing the video footage down was a really valuable way to do that. And then we could document like it was on a trunk or whatever. So it was sort of a weird kind of groundhog version of field work where I always, every day I had to live my day twice. This is just a video of bird attendance at the kennel. Like I mentioned earlier, that was another important thing that we looked at. And this just gives you an idea of one of the aspects of this that we're really interested in is the dogs. Not all the dogs are super friendly towards the birds, so it's a unique thing because on the one hand, it offers a really unprecedented supplemental food resource, but it's not without its dangers and its costs. And these birds are sometimes killed by these dogs. So we wanted to try and track, like, do birds that access the kennel regularly, are they higher quality birds, lower quality? Does it seem to help them? Do they only do it if they're desperate? That kind of thing. So now let's dive into the graphs and the results. I will try and kind of whip through these. I know I'm running a little short on time, and graphs are nobody's favorite thing. But basically, this is some of our preliminary results. I'm actually working on the more official write-up now. But what we found is, perhaps unsurprisingly, that most of their foraging efforts take place on the ground rather than in the trees. So that reflects apparently where the majority of food is for these birds. When they're on a tree, they're spending more time looking through the bark than they are the foliage, though we have to be careful because it's a lot easier to see what they're doing when they're in exposed bark than when they're in like a really dense foliated branch. And then they spend about the same amount of time on the tree interior than they do the tree exterior. And the idea here is it would be interesting to see if these foraging, where they're putting most of their foraging effort mirrors where we see them putting most of their caching effort. This just shows the acquisitions per minute across a number of different territories over the season. And what you can see is in the fall, they're much busier foraging than they are during the incubation period. And that makes a lot more sense because the fall is sort of peak, hide all the food time. And when they're incubating, they've obviously got other things on their plate. But what's really interesting was this statistic right here where we were documenting anywhere from 133 to 228 caches per hour. These birds are incredibly busy during this fall time. For food types, we documented 956 total acquisitions, most of which we never stood any chance of identifying. It was just a dark colored little tiny blob in the bird's mouth, and we never got further than that. But among that 40% that we did identify, we found 6 main food types and 29 different individual foods. So this shows those 6 main food types and how much they're represented in the diet over the season. And so these foods really seem to match with what we would expect be most kind of abundant and available in the environment at the time. So for example, kind of heading into summer, you see this huge upswing in invertebrates because that's really when the invertebrates are starting to bust out in that period of time, versus kind of in the fall, you see a higher representation of things like mushrooms and animal flesh. This shows the food acquisitions relative to field efforts because we weren't necessarily around for the entirety of the month for all of these. So this just kind of puts everything on an even playing field. And you can see that April is really one of the key months that they're recovering a lot of food. And that makes sense when you put it in perspective with that's the period of time that they have nestlings. And so that's a time when they're really busy. For caching behavior, we documented 364 total caches. This is just a couple of examples of what that looks like. This is a low bush cranberry that they've tucked into this birch tree or aspen tree. And then this is a caterpillar that they have hidden and killed it and then hidden it in the witch hair of this branch, spruce branch. The average distance from where they collected the food to where they cached it was only about 12 meters, which isn't very far, but again, kind of have to be careful with some of this data because these birds can fly a lot faster than we could run. So if they were ever going to fly more than about 25 meters away from us, we were rarely ever going to catch them in time to actually see them cache. And then most of the caches that they made were on the eastern facing side of the tree. They tucked most of their caches into bare bark relative to the foliage. They put most of it on the exterior rather than the interior of the tree, which is pretty interesting because the exterior is going to be the part that's sort of most vulnerable to and the least insulated to the climate. On the other hand, it's the most accessible. This just shows that caching rate anywhere from 46 to 179 an hour. Oh, I'm sorry, I misspoke when I show you the other version of this graph. That was showing you the number of food acquisitions they made. Hopefully I said that at the time, versus this is showing the number of caches. So they're getting, hundreds of individual food items, and then they're also caching, up to 179 times over this period, particularly in the fall, which is what those boxes are. For our camera traps, we deployed, I should update that, we actually ended up deploying 30 cameras, 4 in the fall, 18 in the spring, and then another, what would that be? Another 8 in the fall of 2019. We ended up getting 12 successfully capturing recovery. Most of our cameras failed. As it turns out, it's really hard to get a camera to go off when a gray jay flies in and takes off in 5 seconds or less. But we actually got some really good data from this. So this was a really interesting case where the bird that made the cache wasn't the one that recovered it. Because our entire population was banded, we were actually able to show that it was the mate that had recovered this food. So whether or not it wasn't around, we saw the bird make the cache. How this bird knew that it was there, or if it just stumbled onto it by accident, is still, you know, anyone's guess. Kennel Results. The story here is that there was a lot of birds there, depending on the time of year. At most, there could be up to 13 birds, but on average, depending on the season, there could be anywhere from 1 to 8 birds at the kennel. So this was clearly an important resource for many of the local birds in the park, or in this particular part of the park. For our camera traps, this I did update. 41% of our caches were recovered by something else. In 2 cases, they were recovered by other jays, and we were able to individually identify them thanks to the bands. But in 3 cases, they were actually stolen by rodents. So this may suggest that their caches are getting pilfered by other animals more often than we originally thought. The average cache lifespan was about 16 days, but our standard deviation was in the neighborhood of 17 days. So there was a lot of variability in terms of how long caches last. In 2 cases, they were actually recovered within 24 hours. If they recovered them and ate them on the spot, or if they just recovered them and recached them immediately, is anyone's guess. The maximum verified time that it took them to recover a cache was 55 days. And what I mean by verified is we actually captured the recovery on camera. Because when we were doing this study, you know, we would check in, we would physically check in on these cameras, you know, at regular intervals. And so in all of those cases where the cameras failed, the reason we knew they failed is because we could see that the cache was gone, but then there was nothing on the camera. So among those failed caches, the maximum time that elapsed before disappearance was 179 days. I couldn't put this in a paper, but I think in all of those cases, it was removed by an animal. These caches are so incredibly secure to the tree. I don't think there's any way they're getting blown out. Maybe it happens rarely, but I think that 179-day actually reflects the full period of time that these birds took to recover these caches. So just to kind of visually summarize what we found in terms of foraging and caching. For foraging, they spent, here's my little jay, it's gonna move around. They spent most of their time foraging on the ground. If they were in a tree, they were kind of in these bare branches, and they spent the same amount of time in the interior or the exterior. So they weren't really in the foliage. In terms of food, their diet, like if I had to be an animal, I think I could happily live as a Canada jay. Their diet, not so different than mine, with the exception that they are eating a lot more bugs than I eat. When it comes to caching, didn't generally fly so far to make their cache, and when they made it, it was in areas like this kind of external bare branches, instead of you know, tucking it into the foliage. So bringing this all together, how does Denali compare to some of these populations that we know more about? Well, we found that they have a pretty similar diet. Their caching and foraging rates are pretty consistent with some of those other populations. And the cache distribution and location also appears consistent. So that's important because that tells us we might actually be in a pretty good position to compare what's happening with these Algonquin populations to what's happening in our Denali populations. Future sources of study. It was an interesting period of time to sort of take this snapshot of what jays are doing, because 2019 was a really warm year in Alaska. It was the latest kind of permanent snowfall that was on record, and one of the earliest snow melts on record. But they did really well. In fact, in 2019, it was the first year they've ever documented a nest successfully fledged 5 young. So that kind of calls into question this whole idea of the freezer breaking. Maybe these birds are such successful generalists that, you know, whatever's going to happen, as long as there is something to eat, they're going to be able to shift gears and shift their foraging strategy in such a way that they can take advantage of what's available. What we have left to look at is comparing more closely how food variability, or how variability in food acquisition and caching relate to reproductive success. It's going to be pretty hard to do that in a robust way, considering we only have about a year's worth of data, but we're certainly going to try, and my hope is that a future study would be able to look at this more closely. If any of you, I mean, obviously we're all in the middle of a pandemic, there's probably not many of you that have plans to head up to Denali, but in any future years, you know, most of these birds are still banded, and the park is still collecting data, so you are more than welcome to report any of these banded birds if you happen to be in the park in a future year and see some of them. All right, so with that, acknowledgements to the Tanana, Atna, Denali, and Koyukon people, that's on whose historic lands that this research took place on. My J team up at Denali National Park, the many field techs that helped me. And with that, I would be more than happy to take any questions you have about Canada Jays. Thank you so much for listening and spending your Tuesday night with me.
Two hands clapping on behalf of your audience of very grateful people.
Thank you so much, Kaylee. If people want to ask questions, they can ask them, you know, turn on your microphone and ask, or you can put it into the chat box.
If I may, I'll read two that Jim Danzenberger was kind enough to put in. The last one is the one that we're all wondering. Could you explain the connection of putting your cache on the eastern side of the tree, at least?
So yeah, good question. I don't know. I don't know what the strategy there is. You know, knowing that information is helpful because we could take temperature measurements to see how an eastern side is going to sort of fluctuate throughout the day, and then use that to model any future experiments. But why they are preferring to cache on the eastern side, I really couldn't tell you at this point. Yeah, it was an interesting piece of data.
Laurel asked a question about the origin of the Whisky Jack, and thanks to Matt Bartels zipping in there and throwing a Wikipedia. If those of you who are able to look at your chat box, you can see what was put in there. And may I mention, I also was able to throw in the KUOW piece you mentioned, Kaylee, the link there on the chat box, and also your Facebook group called West Coast Birders.
Oh, thanks, Elaine.
Jim also asked early on, because he's so enamored with three-toed woodpeckers, were there burns particularly that had something to do with your three-toed woodpecker observations?
Not recent burns. I tell you what, there were some really, really old snags. I mean, they must have been decades old, but no, there was, for the amount of three-toads we saw, I was very surprised given the what stage of growth that the forest that we were in were at. Yeah, took me by surprise.
If anyone wants to either unmute yourself and ask a question or type it in, we welcome you. This was just fantastic. And in the meantime, could you tell us about Crow or No again? Every Wednesday we can go to your Twitter site and look at a photo and play Crow or No.
Yeah, so in an effort to kind of help people hone their birding skills, particularly with respect to discriminating those, you know, there's a variety of black birds that on first glance look shockingly similar, whether it's crows and ravens or crows and grackles. I play a game called Crow or No every Wednesday, and you can play it on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. And you can find me at Corvid Research, you know, on all the platforms. And it's a pretty simple game. You always have a 50-50 chance. I post a picture, and you just have to decide if that picture is of a bird with the word crow in its recognized, meaning what the name you would find in a field guide. And I will tell you, it can be a very hard game, even for someone like me. In fact, I just played a game a few weeks ago where not even I could discern whether or not the bird was a crow or raven. It was just that funky of a position and that poor of lighting. So it's a pretty fun and often very challenging game, but I'm really happy with how many people have reported that it has truly improved their birding skills and their ability to not only discern these birds, but also learn and appreciate that corvids are a much more diverse group than many people realize, and there are many species of these birds around the world. So yeah, it's a fun game for a lot of reasons. I am going to just pause for just a second because I realize that my computer is going to die. My charger's in the next room. I will be right back. Think of your questions. I will come back.
Boy, that photo of
I have a question.
hang on.
I'll ask when she comes
Yeah,
back.
that photo that Kaylee showed, I think it was her hand holding that juvenile. That's a huge bird. I didn't realize how large they were. It's incredible.
That was an adult, but yeah, big. They are so much bigger than people think because you look at them and they look like chickadees, and so people think they're going to be like really small, but they are not. They are quite robust birds.
If I may ask a question, how, given that the Whisky Jacks live year-round in Denali and the ravens live year-round in Denali, how do they relate to each other? Are they really competitors in any respect, or do they just mostly ignore the other?
That's a great question. In our experience, they, except at the kennels, they were rarely ever in competition. I mean, there were occasionally times where there would be a pine squirrel or snowshoe hare that got hit on the road. And so you would see a mix of ravens, Canada jays, and magpies all trying to feed off that carcass. And generally speaking, the ravens got, were able, if they were there, none of the other birds were on the carcass. But ravens relative to Canada jays are much more wary. And so, Canada jays can be there. I mean, their tolerance for people is just so much more than magpies or ravens. So with accessing, carcass on a roadway, the Canada jays are at an advantage because they just don't care when the cars are driving by. Meanwhile, the ravens and magpies get spooked more easily. Outside of that, though, we really didn't see any competition, and Canada jays, their diet is pretty different than the ravens, because they're eating these small things like blueberries and, slugs, versus the ravens are mostly going after some of the bigger food items. There are probably instances, we never experienced it in the field season we were there, of ravens depredating nests. I'm sure if they found a Canada jay nest, they would happily eat them. Most of our nests, if they were depredated by something, it was actually by either a pine squirrel or a goshawk. So by and large, they kind of just seem to each have their own niche and they stick to them.
Matt's hired as our audiovisual consultant. He's doing a little puppet show there. Oh, look at that magpie. Whoa.
Oh, yay, the Canada Jay stickers. Thanks, Matt. I was able to scroll. Oh yeah, and you have the magpie. Very good. Yep. I wish so. I have an Etsy shop. If anybody is seeing the stickers and wants one, if we had a live one, I would have them here for you. I do have an Etsy shop where I have my stickers. I don't have anything in the shop now, but if you follow the blog or follow me anywhere else, I'll always update you when I have stickers available. Right. And I have a really cool upcoming project where I've teamed up with a black birder and artist she's going to design a sticker for me, and all of the proceeds are going to go to an organization that helps get Black people out into the outdoors. So stay tuned for that. But thanks so much, Matt, for showing your swag off.
Fantastic.
Let's see, I'm not seeing any more questions here, Kaylee, but thank you so much for giving us this presentation and being willing to talk to WAS again. I know it's only been a few months since you were able to speak with us before, but your talks are always so lively and entertaining. I'm really grateful for your time, and I hope we'll be hearing from you in the future. do you have any plans lined up? Any job or any more research lined up?
Well, so I'm knocking on wood. I am in the process of, fingers crossed for me, putting together a postdoc with a different faculty member at the UW, looking at the reproductive ecology of Tinian monarchs. They're a really small endemic songbird to the island of Tinian, which is in the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, close to Saipan and Guam, if those names ring more of a bell. So hopefully that's where I will be next year, is actually on this very small remote island of Tinian, looking at this bird. It was listed back in the 90s and early 2000s, and then it was delisted. And so now we want to just kind of check in and see how it's doing. So I will be sort of taking a pause from my corvid research and expanding my CV to include more other kinds of songbirds, but it'd be a great professional opportunity. And sort of given the job climate at this point, I would be more than happy for anything that I can get that keeps me in the realm of bird work.
Fantastic. May I mention, Cinny? Cinny and I first met you, Kaylee, at the Weenus campout, and I bet quite a number of the people who are watching this have spent wonderful summer Memorial days at Weenus. So you link us together in a big way, and well, we of course want you to find new employment, but if you have to stay at UW for longer, we're really happy.
I'm happy too. It's yeah, it'll be a great opportunity to, yes, the faculty member is Beth Gardner. Some of you may be familiar with that name. She's one of the PIs on the project that you may have seen for the student who is looking at how COVID is impacting bird presence in Seattle. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that citizen science project.
Olivia's
but yeah, so that's the advisor that I would be working with on my new project. So it'll be a great source of skill enhancement for me, and I will be more than happy to come to WAS in real life or virtually and tell you guys all about the Tinian monarch when I know more about them and I have monarch adventures.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Kaylee. We really appreciate your time tonight.
Thank you so much for having me.